Welcome to Popcorn Psychology, the podcast where we watch blockbuster movies and psychoanalyze them. My name is Brittney Brownfield, and I'm a child therapist, and I'm joined by
Ben Stover, individual therapist.
Hannah Espinoza, marriage and family therapist.
We're all licensed clinical professional counselors, also known as therapists, who practice out of Chicago. Even though we are licensed mental health professionals, this podcast is purely for entertainment purposes and to fulfill our love of dissecting pop culture in all forms.
Please remember that even though we are all licensed therapists, we aren't your therapist.
If you are struggling with mental health symptoms, please find a local mental health provider.
Hi. Welcome, everybody. So we are Popcorn Psychology. I am Brittney. This is
Ben Stover. Nice to meet you all.
Today we're Janet Snake-Hole and Burt Macklin from
FBI.
Parks and Rec, if you are familiar. We also typically have a third, Hannah, but she's off in the Pacific Northwest right now. Can everyone say hi to Hannah? All right. So, unless you don't know, Popcorn Psychology, we are licensed therapists who work out of Chicago at private practices, things like that. So we're all therapists who actively see clients. And our podcast is that we pick a movie every episode, whether that's a rom-com like While You Were Sleeping, or a superhero movie like Batman Begins, or a fandom like Harry Potter or Hunger Games, and we talk about it through the lens of a therapist. What are we noticing here in terms of mental health themes? If one of these characters was in our office, how would we treat them as a therapist? Would they be treatable? Would they allow a therapist to help them? I'm looking at you, Bruce Wayne, because I don't think you would. So it's our kind of way of sneaking a little mental health or a lot of mental health education through the fun, medium of movies, TV shows, and fandom. So today we were kind of going to touch upon a few places where we have seen good mental health and good therapists, and a few places where we haven't seen the best therapy portrayed within TV and movies. And as always, we welcome any audience interactions. So if anybody has any questions, thoughts, feel free to raise your hand, go to the mic at any time during our talk, and we are happy to bring your feedback in. So I guess where we can start is, let me ask you this. Has anyone ever seen what they consider to be a good therapist in a movie or a TV show? There's a lot of cringe faces.
Did you guys notice that not one hand shot up and went, yes, I saw one? Like, how many people did what I just would? I'm like, wait, okay, who had a good one? Oh, wait, no, they slept with their clients again. Oh, we got a hand. Can you go to the mic there so we can hear you? Love to hear what your input is.
The only one I can think of is Dr. Sidney from MASH.
Oh, MASH.
That's
a deep cut.
Was that his name? I think Sidney. Was that his last name? I'm trying to remember.
I'm trying to remember too.
But that was.
But interesting that you had to go.
We got approval from Ghostly Podcast back there.
But interesting you had to go all the way back to the 70s to find that reference, though, unfortunately. So part of why we wanted to do this show, besides teaching about mental health, is to kind of dispel a lot of the how we've seen therapists portrayed in a lot of movies and TV shows in a way that is not super. It wouldn't make me feel confident as a person going to see a therapist.
Right. Seeing a therapist should be a safe situation where you're able to have an open space to process whatever is going on in a non-judgmental way with someone who's going to approach you with kindness and curiosity and empathy and challenge you to explore new behaviors and thought patterns about things that are going on in your life. It should never, ever be about any kind of relationship.
Yeah.
Romantic relationship, ever. And seeing that becomes a narrative trope that writers love to use makes all of us therapists sick. It's like the first thing they teach you in grad school. Like, rule number 1, we do not have romantic relationships with our clients. Mm-hmm. Rule number 2, see rule number 1.
Yeah.
Very simple.
So I'm curious, how many here have watched Ted Lasso? Show of hands.
Oh.
Now, Ted Lasso, we actually did a panel 2 days ago with Dr. Scott Jordan about Ted Lasso. Ted Lasso portrays mental health in a beautiful way, most ways, right? It's a good portrayal of how you can be two things at once. You can be both very positive, but also very anxious and struggling. It also is a portrayal of a decent therapist. Ted's therapist, Dr. Sharon?
Dr. Sharon.
Yeah, she's a therapist who is very available but has good boundaries, isn't trying to become friends with her clients, even though that is a tricky situation where you're on staff for a team where you're kind of in the mix, even though you are their therapist. And she actually does a good job of maintaining an appropriate boundary, not even just for herself, but also the teammates as they're coming in and out of her office. Now, that show also has a common trope of a really bad therapist trope, which is that Ted's couples therapist starts dating his wife.
After they divorce, which, let's consult the ethics board. You all, is this okay? Wait, is anybody nodding? Look around. Did anybody say it was okay? Did you see anybody say it was okay?
I did not see anybody.
I did not see anybody say. So let's say, "Yay, Dr. Sharon!" Woo! And boo, Dr. Jacob.
Because I would say what felt really shocking watching Ted Lasso is that up to that point, it did such a phenomenal job portraying therapy, portraying mental health, portraying panic attacks. Like so many tropes that you saw on that show about mental health were so good that the fact that they had that happen on that show and no one seems to have a problem with it. The only issue is just almost like this doctor just had the vibe of, oh, Ted's ex-wife's new boyfriend. And that was the antagonism with it. Not, what the hell? Oh, I almost swore hard there. What the hell is her couples therapist doing dating your wife? Because I'll tell you this, as a therapist myself, once you're my client, it's like you're my cousin. You know what I mean? Like, there's no part of me that's like, oh, I think, actually, especially since I'm helping you with the relationship issues, I really think you're very dateable to me. So the fact that that doesn't get addressed on that show in any way, other than he's a foil for Ted romantically, seemed very out of character for the writing of that show.
It did, but not for the showrunner, I think.
Oh, okay.
As he also did Scrubs and Cougar Town and
Shrinking,
where some questionable boundaries start to become a narrative device yet again. And I think as a professional therapist, it is something that I feel like goes against the mission of what we're trying to do with our show, which is to try to create an accessible way that people can talk about mental health through the lens of characters and try to diffuse some stigma that everybody is going to encounter mental health at some point in their life. Like, I've been to rock concerts seeing Disturbed and Godsmack, and they did something similar to what we're going to do right now. If you have known anybody who's dealt with mental health in your life, raise your hand. Have you dealt with it yourself? Take a look around. Feel some peace in that. It's normal. Accessing therapy should be normal, and that shouldn't be a place of fearing that someone's evaluating you for your dating. And whether you're a viable dating partner. And I think seeing it in Ted Lasso, where they did such a beautiful job addressing mental health concerns so clearly, so cleanly, and compassionately, to then be like, oh, and by the way, the therapist is dating his wife now. It's something that makes me scream internally and sometimes externally. I don't know about you.
Yeah. And I would say what's interesting about doing this podcast is we watch a variety of things, like I said. And so then watching something again through the eyes of a therapist can be very telling about the legitimacy of the writing and the storytelling. And there are some places where you can be very pleasantly surprised. Like WandaVision was a place where we were pleasantly surprised about how mental health was portrayed.
How many of you guys saw that?
Yeah. We shall not speak of her development, Wanda, in Multiverse of Madness. Also, as mental health people, that was very disappointing as someone who had so much growth in WandaVision and really took accountability in a lot of ways for how her unprocessed grief harmed others in a really real way. For then to her totally switch on a dime and continue that unhealthy cycle with others, with a child to America, was really difficult to see. And I know Sam Raimi's here, and I'm going to try my best not to fight him about it.
I mean, if he wants to, join
Fight
us,
us?
that would be. I think that would be okay. But I think For me, I'm a trauma therapist. Trauma is my specialty. I work with it every day, all day long. I work with first responders primarily, and watching that show do such a beautiful job, even though the way Agatha forced her into it was completely unethical and harmful. Seeing a show depict what it's like to live with trauma, that it's these little vignettes, these stories from your life that get stuck and start defining how you see yourself and how you see the world, and create a protective shell that you then harden as you go through more in life. Watching that be shown so beautifully was really meaningful to me as a trauma therapist, because it's something I can point to people and go like, look, this is what we're gonna do. We're gonna, but not force, but we're gonna walk backwards in time to look for these moments that have defined why you need to have this hardened exterior, why you have to keep people out, why you formed extra parts of yourself to keep you defended. To see them then torpedo all of that in Multiverse of Madness had me doing yet again,
Yeah.
why?
Yeah, because I think with the new Marvel Disney Plus shows, it is giving us ample stuff to watch that is finally starting to touch upon mental health. Like Moon Knight's another one where they get right up to it with like the portrayal of DID, but then skirt a little bit for, you know, the fantasticness of the story. So that's another thing where they almost get it right.
Almost.
Until they don't. I would say a place, though, where I was pleasantly surprised about mental health was Falcon and the Winter Soldier. I don't know how many of you guys watched that, but watching the story of Bucky Barnes and watching an Avenger finally friggin' get therapy was very nice to see. And a therapist who actually was a very good match for the client in front of her.
I thought that was great, particularly doing what I do. You have to meet clients where they are. You have to learn to speak their language, and having the therapist we saw be competent in the culture of military and warriors and be able to speak the language and have some tolerance for the harshness and the crassness and the skepticism of the clients while being able to sit in it and operate from it and use it to break the shell, I thought was beautifully done.
Yeah. She does a good job of using what we call in the field irreverence, which is when you have a hard client who's not really buying what you're selling. Sometimes you want to do what sometimes therapists call spit in their soup, which is lean into the way that they're being difficult, which is like, you're right, okay, fine, who cares? You know what, if you want to do that, it's not really what I told you to do, but fine. And I know it can seem off-putting when you watch it on screen, but that is a therapeutic tactic that sometimes therapists employ to, it's not quite reverse psychology, but it's to get people to kind of own up to what they're doing and how it's not working. And what are we doing here together? Why are you coming to my office? I know for him it's kind of different because it was sanctioned therapy. But, you know, being able to work to meet the client that you have in front of you, not just only be one version of yourself as a therapist, is important to keep in mind.
It is important, and it's important to be flexible and work with clients to meet them and be able to address what they need, how they need it. Mm-hmm. And so many times we see in shows that therapists are like, oh, well, I do this style. I'm this kind of therapist. We do this kind of work here. And that's not what real therapists do. It's our job to find a way to connect to the client as they are and help them in the way that they need, not be the keeper of all the mental health secrets that we're then going to bestow onto you.
Mm-hmm. I would say another kind of unlikely place where irreverence is used by a therapist and done well is Rick and Morty. Actually, with Miss Sarandon, who's here this weekend, is she does the voice of a family therapist that works with Rick's family. It's the famous Pickle Rick episode, if anyone's familiar with that. And he does the same thing where he's one of those clients who comes in and he's like, therapy's stupid. I'm smarter than therapy. I don't need this. I don't need that. Yeah. Therapy's boring. And she actually delivers a speech that I kind of paraphrase and stole with my clients, which is, sometimes the maintenance of being well is maintenance, and it's boring, and it's work, and it's monotonous. It's mundane. That doesn't, and the way she says in her speech is like also brushing your teeth every day is mundane. Washing your ass every day is mundane. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it or that it's not healthy for you to do it. And you have to get over this idea that things have to be exciting in a way for them to be worthwhile. which is something that comes up a lot within therapy, is this idea that life should be exciting in a way that is chaotic and confusing passion and those kind of things for a positive quality of life.
Absolutely. Thinking that there's some big action you can take to solve everything. Or that one session and fixed are realities, I think is a really challenging aspect of working with movie characters in particular, where they come into session once and the therapist goes, beard stroke. It's this.
I'm gonna
and the
crack
client
you
goes,
like an egg.
and they're better. End scene.
Yeah.
But it's not real, and it does take time and effort, and it takes doing the little things, following through the mundane steps of working towards wellness, and sometimes it's slow.
Yeah. And I think another movie that portrays that well is The Sixth Sense. How here has seen The Sixth Sense? Maybe not a long time.
That's a lot of hands.
There's a lot of hands.
The movie's from 99.
That is actually, so I'm a child therapist, and so that is one of the best portrayals of a child therapist I've ever seen on screen. And, I don't want to say the spoiler, just in case no one's seen it 20 years after the fact.
Brittney, it's from 99. I think we're good.
But I think that is a good example of sort of like what real therapy can look like. Is you just kind of hang out with the client, especially kid client. You kind of just are with them. You meet them where they're at. You do magic tricks. You just chit chat. You kind of shoot the S together. And you just try to be what they need when they need it until finally they trust you enough to tell you their big secret. So that movie actually is an excellent portrayal of kind of the steps of therapy as well, especially when you work with kids. That you don't have to, we talk about this a lot on the podcast, there's this idea, and I get this when I work with kids and this is anxiety from their parents of like, you need to talk about the issue right now. Like when they come into your office, by the first, second session, you need to be talking about whatever the thing is. And what I have to impress upon parents is that's not me pushing to get to the objective is not really going to do anybody any favors. Especially with kids, because I don't know about you guys if you ever went to therapy as kids or know kids in therapy, they're very rarely choosing to go to therapy. It's usually like my mom or dad's making me, my school's making me. Like there's not a lot of kids who are self-actualized enough that they're walking up to their parents and like, I would really love to unpack some of my trauma with a therapist. Can you find one for me? And so what that movie does really well is it demonstrates that you do have to take your time, and it's okay. And I warn parents, like the first several sessions, maybe the first month or two of sessions, might be me and your kid playing games, talking about Marvel, talking about TV shows, talking about their friends, talking about benign school stuff, until your kid realizes that I can be someone that they can trust to tell their secret, until I'm no longer a stranger. And in that movie, you see him just kind of goofing off a little bit, being calm, being quiet, being gentle with him until the kid feels comfortable to tell him the big thing. And once the kid tells you the big thing, then your work together can really kick it up a notch. And it's almost like going up the roller coaster and now you're speeding along.
I agree. It's really important to, even with children that come into therapy, to make them feel like the space is theirs and that the therapist is their therapist, not mom's agent or dad's agent.
Yes.
It needs to be somebody, their own space where they can process through the problems as they see them, the way they see it. Because how many of us can look back on our life and things that happened as kids and go, oh, that's what was going on there, and go like, your adult brain tries to play it back and go back into the scene as a kid and fix it from your adult perspective, but the kid never had that. So we have to, as a therapist, meet a child from the way they see the world, not the way the adults do, or even the way we do as a therapist. You have to meet and work with kids there. And I think Bruce Willis did a phenomenal job of executing that and scene of sitting with Haley Joel Osment's character and letting him have his space. It was just about him.
Yeah. And not everything we talk about on Popcorn Psychology, it has a therapist in it. A lot of what we talk about actually is just what are we noticing thematically that shows us something about mental health. Like one of our last episodes was The Mummy, and we talked about, does Evie have ADHD? And what do we see and not see that shows that to us? And I would say one thing that I know you've been talking about, Ben, because Ben's the one on the podcast that has his own child, is Bluey.
How many of you guys watch Bluey? Okay, who loves Bluey? Yes. Did anybody see the episode Space? Who cried? Yeah, every time? Yeah. I think Bluey is one of the finest examples of ways that we can use even a 7-minute cartoon to make things accessible. In the episode Space, we see 3 of the little boy dog characters starting to play out this scene where they're out exploring space, which, like our Hungry Chillabite friends, and many of us Star Wars fans have gone, a space story? I'm here for that, right? Or at a fan convention where half the people here are wearing Star Wars, Star Trek, or something else space related. So seeing kids just naturally go to that is great. But watching that episode, you get to see one of the kids start playing out his trauma of being left by his mom and getting scared. And remembering that for kids, it's just a flash of a moment that can define how we feel, because feelings are the only way we get to make sense of our experience. Having a feeling about something that happened is the only way we differentiate what was a relevant memory and what goes in a pool. Like, think about your drives to work. When you remember a drive to work, it's one of any of the 1,000 times you did it, right? Okay, I drive past that, I drive past that. But if I ask you about the day your child was born, or the day you got hired at your next job, or the day you graduated, you remember really specific memories. Or the day someone broke up with you. You remember that day, you remember the feeling flashpoint. Watching that episode of Bluey is a fantastic reminder that happens for kids too, but in different ways, because what we see happen for Mackenzie is he keeps trying to break away from the other boys and wants to play like they left him. And it's not until he gets into a slide tunnel that the memory becomes clear to him that as a much smaller kid, he got lost and went down the wrong slide and he couldn't find his mom. And the teacher does this beautiful thing where she comes up and says, like, okay, you've seen what's here now. You don't have to keep coming back here anymore. Mm-hmm. And for me as a trauma therapist, that's what I try to guide clients to every day is, let's get back, let's re-explore this moment where you got hurt, but from a place where you have resources and aren't scared, aren't lost, aren't afraid, and your body's not activated. And seeing that in a 7-minute kids cartoon, beautiful. And over, we see these things popping up now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would say, kind of going back to how our podcast started, because I know this usually sparks some conversation, is the very first episode of our podcast is about The Last Jedi. So let's talk about trauma, now that we're already talking about it. Who here likes The Last Jedi? That's my girl. Ooh. Who here hates The Last Jedi? It's usually this split, 50-50, right?
Yeah, it's getting less and less over time.
Yeah, and
it's not aging well.
The Last Jedi actually is what inspired our podcast, as we were working all together as therapists, and we loved The Last Jedi, and we couldn't really wrap our head around why people not only didn't like it, but really couldn't stand the portrayal of Luke Skywalker. And that is what inspired us to start our podcast itself, to really help people understand why we as therapists not only had no problem with that portrayal of Skywalker, we actually loved that portrayal of Luke Skywalker. And that for us, it was so clear that he was someone who was not dealing with his trauma, who had been traumatized, and was engaging in one of the most classic trauma responses there is, which is fly and avoid.
Yep. And
then if you're going to bring it up to me, you better be ready for this attitude that's going to fly at your face to keep you at arm's length. Every step to his portrayal in Last Jedi made sense to us as therapists, and as therapists who've dealt with many people who have gone through trauma. And we can understand why, and Ben can speak to this more, as he is a Luke Skywalker lover. I'm a Luke Skywalker hater. Is that, it is hard to see someone that we want to think of as our hero behaving in a way that doesn't align with that image.
It is hard. I mean, so many things about what draw us to fandoms, what draw us to these fantastical stories is finding hope. And Luke has been a representation of that throughout his existence. But when you really explore the hero's journey, any story, going far back as the Odyssey and further, the cost of the journey on the hero to provide us that hope almost always consumes them. And watching what happened to Luke makes sense from a realistic standpoint. Luke has been through such tremendous amounts of trauma. There is no way that watching his nephew take over the mantle of his father, which he gave every last ounce of his soul to fight against, follow the same path and the same cycle repeat again, that it's not very likely Luke would find that light within him again, and it's watching him retreat away was really hard for people. How many people had a problem with Last Jedi because of that? Like watching Luke not be the light anymore.
Yeah.
Part of it, yeah. It would, I mean, it had problems, right? It had problems. Especially all the anything but Luke and Rey. But
what I loved about that, and I think more movies, I think the first time I felt this way, this is back when I was an intern as a therapist, is the Hunger Games, right? I think it also was a story that behaved very similarly, which is a lot of stories before then were, our hero goes through something wildly traumatic, and then once the trauma's over, they're like, back to business, back to being charismatic, back to being a leader, as if out of sight, out of mind. And I think what the Hunger Games did so well with Katniss, and then I think what Last Jedi did with Luke, is that no, there are ramifications, real life ramifications to going through horrific struggles, and that we're not really doing, I think, human beings a disservice by not seeing those stories, by not seeing that trajectory seen on screen. You know, that these stories prior to this level of emotional intelligence, we're perpetuating this idea that you should be fine. And if you're not fine, what's wrong with you? You know, it kind of continues that, you know, part of our mission statement with the show is decreasing the stigma, right? Stopping the stigma around mental health. And a big part of that stigma, at least in our culture, especially in Midwesterner culture, is you're fine. And if you need therapy, you must be genuinely crazy or something along those lines, right? Like something's wrong with you. And what I like about these newer wave of things like WandaVision, like Falcon and the Winter Soldier, like what we talked about Hunger Games, Last Jedi, is this idea that you can both love a hero, see yourself maybe even in that hero, and they can have hard times where they don't really act the way that they should, where they might be really unlikable, really hard to deal with, not like themselves at all possibly, totally go backwards in their progress. And they can still have a, I don't know if I want to say redemption arc, because I don't love the vibe of that, but they can still grow. And they can become a more integrated version of themselves too. Because I think with a lot of these stories, like even, I'll keep going back to Hunger Games, is she doesn't become someone that's like, oh, I love being a leader. Like a lot of the Hunger Games ripoffs after that were very like, I am now the figurehead of this community and I'm the leader. And she was like, no, I want to go back to my hometown. And I want to be where it's quiet. I want to take a nap for the next month and a half. And I don't want to talk to anybody about anything. And I was like, that is actually more of a realistic version, I think, of someone who's gone through these hard struggles. You know, and I also wonder with Luke Skywalker, if part of his thing is, I want a break. I need to go somewhere where nobody knows me. There's no pressure to be Luke Skywalker, that presence. And I can finally have space to deal or not deal, emphasis on not deal,
right,
with what I've gone through and the mistakes that I've made. Because also with Luke Skywalker, that big mistake is, oh my God, I almost killed my nephew, right? And I think too, when you become sort of like a monolithic figure within a community like Luke is, your identity becomes really specific. And so when I work with people, you might have heard this through Brené Brown, their idea of being shame-based versus wholehearted, which is when your identity is wrapped up in a specific version of yourself and you do something that pushes on that identity, you can't really deal. It really makes you feel a lot of shame and you shut down or your self-esteem tanks or whatever. And so I think for him, he was lacking that dimension that allowed him to make mistakes, maybe make huge mistakes, and still can be a leader within his community, still be a quote-unquote good person or a hero.
Definitely, and I like that we're starting to go through this narrative period lately where we're seeing the effects of the heroic act on the hero, right? watching all of the recovery that needs to be done. It doesn't matter how glorious the act is in the stories other people tell. Getting the chance to see our heroes have to go through the work it takes to recover from what they had to go through in order to do the heroic act. Oftentimes, you must become a monster yourself or find a monstrous part to deal with a great evil. Luke's battle against Darth Vader in The Return of the Jedi, we watched Luke confront his darkness and come this close. It was not until that flap on his black suit opens, revealing that white inner side to it, that we see it even visually represented for us, that Luke has rejected the darkness in his heart and throws his lightsaber and says, I won't fight you. Mm-hmm. It's not until that point that Luke recognizes this for himself, that the monster it would take for me to defeat this, I can't become. I can't pay that price. And watching hero stories over and over now confront those things because we as the audience know our story. When we've done great things, we know what it took out of us to do. And I think, well, as going back to TLJ, the problems that it had, the issues and the bad storytelling that existed in some parts of it that didn't exist with Luke, was watching that play out in front of us for the first time with one of our mythic heroes of society. Look at the cost on him. Mm-hmm. Luke had to confront his father. He had to fire a torpedo that blew up a Death Star with 2 million people on board. That's a lot of ethical issues that can cause a moral injury. It's not going to be simple to recover from that.
Yeah.
And watching that happen in front of us is something we thought was important to convey as therapists to the world. Like, hold on. Let's not defend the parts of the movie that are bad, but let's look at the real psychology we see that I think is important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, and also another recent fandom, we can swerve away from Star Wars, that we really liked, and we actually talked about, I think, last year here at Fan Expo, is Stranger Things. Stranger Things Season 4, I don't know how many of you guys have caught that, is one of the best portrayals of not just going through a trauma, like we've talked about time and time again, but also depression. You know, seeing Max on screen in that season was really hard to watch. You know, if you've ever gone through depression yourself, I have. You know, you could really see the way she shut down, the way she's so irritable, the way that she won't almost let herself feel better. It was such a realistic portrayal of what depression can really look like and how it's not always, I mean, she definitely looks sad as hell. So that was that going on. But also being angry, not allowing other people to help you feel good. You know, so much of the struggle with depression and where it's such a great con artist is it feeds itself. You don't deserve to feel better, so you don't get to do the things that make you feel good, which will reaffirm how you're feeling, which then will reaffirm that messaging, and then we're going to ride this cycle to hell together, the two of us.
You know, shame is a powerful emotion. Mm-hmm. It operates on the same biological principles as disgust. So I'm going to trigger this for you guys for a second so you can see. I want you to think about having leftovers at home in the fridge. But they've been there for a couple days. Maybe you went away for the weekend, but you had something you were really looking forward to having that second part of. And you come home and you open that to-go bag and that container and the smell hits and lets you know it's turned. What happens to your hunger?
Plummets.
Right? You feel your mouth watering, you're going to get that excited, and then
yeah.
Your hunger's gone. Just like that. Shame does the same thing to other emotions. Shame is a biological deactivator of arousal states. And this is really important when looking at somebody like Max. You need to feel sad. You need to feel angry. You need to work through the stages of grief in order to move through something that's happened. And if you don't feel like you deserve to do something because it's your fault, that something bad happened, that you failed in some way, the negative thoughts of you don't deserve to feel better because this is your fault, real or not, provable or not, doesn't matter. If it feels real to you, your shame response shuts down your ability to feel other emotions, and you go through this loop of almost activation, almost crying, almost getting angry about it, and then going, no, I don't deserve that. Boom. And we see Max go through that in Stranger Things better than I think I've seen it almost anywhere. But helping people understand that there are things within us that exist to shut down. Shame is the same thing that shuts down that feeling of, I would really like to punch that guy that just cut in front of me in line at the grocery store in the face right now, but then go. You notice my face does the same thing of like, I'm not eating that. That affect stops you in your tracks. And it's really hard to recognize that when we start feeling something we feel like we can't deserve, or we don't deserve to feel better from, it's going to shut us down in the same way.
So we have about 10 minutes left. So I'm curious, does anyone here have any questions, thoughts, comments on what we've talked about so far? Or does anyone here have a fandom or a favorite character that they, I don't know, have questions about or thoughts about in terms of how you've seen them psychologically through the mental health realm? Or like, what would they be like if they saw a therapist? Oh,
Yep.
okay.
I sort of have two. One is when you think of like cop shows like Law and Order and stuff like that, and they have a therapist, especially with children, and they have to like get to what happened. Or I think of Hill House because
Haunting of Hill House?
Haunting in Hill
We
House.
actually do that on the show, and we talk about, yeah.
Because she can feel it, so she doesn't need to know what the secret is. She can find out.
Yeah.
Right. So how bad do they portray it, and how any examples of how good they portray when it's like one-time case and you have to get to the bottom of it? And two, is there ever an instance where someone does not need therapy? I don't know.
So short answer on the last question, no.
So I would say Haunting of Hill House is interesting in that you're right. She can touch the person. I will tell you what's not true about Haunting of Hill House. She calls one person and makes a report against one guy and he's getting arrested and taken downtown. That doesn't happen. I've actually, because I work with kids, unfortunately, I've made a decent amount of reports to children's services. I feel like whenever I'm taking it seriously, they're not. And whenever I'm not taking it seriously, they are. So that part was my biggest bugaboo on Haunting of Hill House. I was like, there's no way on this earth where I could just ring somebody up and be like, arrest this man. And they'd be like, yeah, sure, okay, we'll take him right out of that home. I would say what you're talking about, it's a little out of my wheelhouse because I don't do that work, but there's a difference between being a crisis worker and a social worker and a long-term therapist. So their objectives are different. Like there are people in our field who do things that's called SAS, which is you go out to the home during a crisis and do like an emergency assessment. Those kind of people, they're not going to work with you long term. So their objective is more to get to the bottom of it for the objective of law and order, as you said. And then ideally that kid will be referred on to a therapist who might have to also process the trauma of that. Of like, so you had a lot of adults asking you to tell the same story over and over again.
Right.
And that's also a kid where I would be very slow in the work we did together because I don't want them to think I'm another adult who's like kind of like pulling something from them for my own agenda so I can tell other adults about it. Like that's the kind of case where I'd have to really establish for the kid that my objective with them, our relationship to each other is going to be very different than their experience up to this point.
I agree. I get called to scenes where officers or family members have been injured or unfortunately killed, or and there's a very different type of work that needs to be done in the moment. People need time and space to grieve what's happened to them, what's happened in their life, and you're in a 43-minute episode where you got commercial breaks, you got a tight window where you got to cover this narrative piece and move on. And I think it does a poor job, even though the actor that plays the psychiatrist or psychologist on Law and Order does a wonderful job there. And then I thought it was so interesting they hired him to play Hugo Strange in Gotham. But watching the care that they put into the writing of how he speaks about cases, but then things get resolved so quickly, is not real and doesn't create realistic expectations.
Yeah.
Commander?
Hey there. So are either of you current on Star Trek Strange New Worlds?
I haven't watched it yet, though
Okay.
it looks very fun.
Well, one of the things they keep running with this past season is that the character of young James Kirk is always used as kind of this comic relief because he's constantly going for a snack every time he gets really nervous. And then I thought it was funny that somebody realized, wait, he survived a famine on a failed colony. This is a trauma response. And like, do you think that plays out pretty well based on what I just said?
I mean, I think based on just that little bit you said, so basically you said that this portrayal of Captain Kirk is that he will snack every time he's nervous, as almost like a nervous tic kind of thing, but then he also comes from a background which he experienced great famine. So I think you're hitting upon something which is really real, which is what do we find comforting? What do we find reassuring? I talk a lot with clients about when we have anxiety or trauma, we can have reassurance-seeking behaviors that we fall back into when we are dysregulated. And sometimes that is food. Food is comforting for a lot of people, so sometimes it can be that. I've also worked with a lot of kids who come from rocky backgrounds, and so where they maybe didn't get fed a lot, they were neglected or they were passed around, and so you can have it's very easy to have a very complicated relationship with food as a kid and as an adult because it's tied to survival. It's just not like, oh, I'm a snacker, you know. And when I've worked with kids who've gone through a lot of households, caregivers, been neglected potentially, also they would hoard food, and then their parents would be like, I don't understand, like their adoptive parents or whoever's caretaking at the time would be like, I don't understand why this kid has cake mix or a can of beans in their room. One, that's not fun food. And two, I'm feeding them every mealtime. And I go, yeah, for now. You're feeding them for now. They don't know that you're feeding them tomorrow or next month or in a year. So whatever they got that's good, they're grabbing it because they're hoarding from a survival standpoint. So I'm almost with Kirk too. It makes me wonder, is a part of him like, I got to get food while I can get it, and that's the connection being made.
And watching things like that where they show people having a response that they're trying to re-regulate their body. When we are going through a survival moment, our physiological system is activating. Our cortisol starts firing to prepare our body to receive adrenaline. Adrenaline activates our survival modes where there's no more thinking, there's no more talking, but sometimes in Star Trek, they do a great job of showing like the importance of staying in that window of tolerance and not losing it, because if you lose your mind, like the J.J. Abrams did a good one of that, showing him stay completely cool during the test in the academy where he had to, like, no, we're gonna watch it explode and stay in that pocket where you can think logically, but still operate in a flow state. Because if you get too activated, you lose your ability to think logically and you'll just start reacting. Anybody here lost their keys when they're late to work? What kind of stupid crap do you do in your house to find those keys?
Yeah.
All right, you got a question? Go ahead, please.
I just, the question that you posed in the beginning of kind of why you started this show in terms of in media, do we see good or bad therapists in shows? And so one that I saw recently, The Patient with Steve Carell. Have either of the two of you?
I watched that whole thing.
Yeah, it was really interesting, and I'm kind of just curious on what you think about it, because that was something interesting of therapists are people too, as
Yes.
I'm sure the two of you know. And it's kind of interesting about how you see that raw side of him and how he's not a perfect person, but it's interesting that trauma brings him to a weird, safer place. And I was wondering what your thoughts on that were.
Yeah, have you seen it?
No.
I recommend everybody to watch The Patient. It's like 8 episodes, it's 30 minutes an episode, get into it. I don't know if I'm exactly going to get to what you're saying, but I think that he does an excellent job of a therapist. The way that he tries to continue to engage with him is a very good therapy. Like, I don't feel safe. Therapy can't be done in an unsafe environment. If people who don't know, the premise of the show is he's a therapist that one of his new clients is actually a serial killer who then kidnaps him, keeps him in a basement to heal him from not being a serial killer. And so what he does really well, which actually I was like, they have therapists on staff writing the show, is that he says, he tries to win him over, the serial killer, by saying, for therapy to go well, both the client and the physician, the clinician, have to feel safe. I don't feel safe right now. I don't know how to feel safe right now. And because of that, I don't know how we can work together. And I think that was an excellent, I mean, he doesn't win in that way, but I would say that was an excellent use of something that's very true in therapy, which is that everyone has to feel good and safe. And I think you're right. It does an excellent job of showing that therapists are just humans. Just because we can teach a lot of techniques doesn't mean that we necessarily utilize them well. Because the way I see it, because my sweet mother, who might be listening, when I started therapy, she was like, well, you're a therapist. Why don't you just know what to do? And I go, well, being a person, to be a person is to be nose, like up to your nose at the painting of your life. You can't see yourself. You can't see the big picture of who you are. And part of being a therapist is, and why they're not your friends, they're not your lovers, they're not your wife or your girlfriend or your neighbor if you can help it, is that they don't have any personal bias that keeps them from being able to step back and look at the whole picture of you and notice patterns, notice things that are getting in the way, or the things that you haven't noticed yourself. And so I think that show does an excellent job of showing that you can be a good therapist and kind of have a messy personal life if you can keep it together.
Right, because we all have parts, right?
Yeah.
Like, how many of you are the same person at work that you are at home? No hands. No hands. Okay, so same for us. But that was a really great question, and if you'd like to come up and get a shirt, we've got a lovely shirt for you. I love that question.
Yeah, does anyone else have any questions? I know you had your hand up. Do you still? You're good? Okay. So I think we're wrapping up there, but does anyone else have any comments or questions? I can just say that if you enjoyed what you heard today, we typically will pick a movie an episode. So our recent ones have been a Goofy movie, The Mummy, Spider-Man No Way Home. That's a great one in terms of grief, empathy, the way that he got to see himself at different ages and they got to kind of counsel him. Beautiful, 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 stunning work. So if you, do you have a question? Go ahead.
So, a couple of nights ago when I was having dinner with my family, my brother was like talking about the show. He didn't tell me the name, but like, I think it's like a crime show.
Okay.
And it was something about like a false rape case where like the guy was like, he was found not guilty, but like it still like messed with him. Like he had like nervous breakdowns and stuff. How would you think that would like affect him in like the long run? Because like he was like having all these like problems.
Sure.
I don't know what to explain it. Cause
I mean, I think what you're bringing up, I can generalize that question out. In that whenever we've gone through something that inherently shakes up our ability to feel safe, which can be also being accused of a crime, right? When it turns your life upside down, we have to find a way to process that experience and then to realize that we're not going to be the same person we were before this thing happened that shook up our reality. And I think for a lot of people, there's this idea that, maybe this is what you were thinking, that I have to go back to who I was before, and if I can't do that, then I'm screwed. Something about me I can't fix. And instead it's more like, well, now this thing has happened. We have to radically accept that that's part of your story now. How do you live with that? And how do you try to make a life that feels safe enough again? You'll probably never feel safe as you did before, but that doesn't mean you can't work to a place where you feel safer than you do now.
Yeah, and I think the only follow-up I have on that is I want to say, like, finding the ability to grieve your past self after something happens to you. So many people just come into my office and say, like, I just want to get back to who I used to be. But that person doesn't exist anymore. The person who felt safe doesn't exist anymore, and you have to find a new safe now with what's happened and realize that that's not happening now. That's really easy for me to say at the end of our show in a 4-second clip. So I don't want it to come across like it's that easy. It's not easy. It's really
never
difficult.
That easy.
You have to regulate. There's one thing that heals trauma. There's lots of ways to get there. One treatment isn't necessarily better than another. It's what's right for the person. But you have to be able to have a relaxed muscle body while having the thoughts or memories of what happened to you online to be able to recover from it. But that's a really great question. If you want to come up, we'll give you a shirt. You can choose between the gray and blue or the black and red.
All right, so we got to wrap up. I'm sure we're getting the cane. So, like, you can always find us wherever you listen, Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, wherever you enjoy podcasts. You can find us, Popcorn Psychology. You can find us Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Popcorn Psychology. You can always email us at popcornpsychology@gmail.com, and we're around. We're in Chicago. So, yeah, so thank you all for joining. Thank you for your excellent questions, and I appreciate all your friendly faces that I can find in the crowd while I'm talking. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.